Alan Crown runs a traditional family bakery business with 8 shops in North London. With limited management staff to help him, Alan has always found it difficult to keep track of all his products.
It's very, very difficult to control what you're making and what's going to which shop. We knew it was being made in the bakery because we did have a sheet filled in by them telling us what they'd made, but we didn't know which shop it was going to. That was basically down to the manageresses and the drivers. If the manageresses thought they needed a bit more, they asked for it, but what that usually meant was that somebody else got a bit less.
To help sort out these problems, Alan uses his micro to run what's known as a spreadsheet program, containing all the data concerning the manufacture and distribution of his range of goods. A spreadsheet program is rather like a large chart on squared paper into which you can enter data at will. More importantly, the program allows you to specify the relationship between any of the rows or any of the columns or even between the squares. For instance, these 3 squares are linked by these formulae, so that changing the value in A produces corresponding changes in the other 2 squares which relate to it. So how does a program like this fit into our business?
On the left here we have all the different lines that we make, the bread and the rolls and the small bread and the brown and the wholemeal. And then the columns across are the different shops, what each shop receives. If I move the cursor across, you can see the full screen will move across, and this covers all the 8 shops and the wholesale run as well. And at the end of the sheet, right over here, there's a wholesale column, then a totals column, then a number of flour bags used, and then the value of each line as it's produced.
Now, what do you do if you want to change the amount of stock, say, in one shop?
Order. I just move the cursor over, type in 100, and then by pressing one other button, that number of flour bags used increasing and the value of the sheet increasing as well. The printer produces what I have in the computer as hard copy for the bakehouse, and they use that for the daily production, all the numbers of different lines and the actual numbers of bags of flour that we need for the day. This really takes away quite a lot of the guesswork from the bakery.
By reducing the element of guesswork, Alan has also been able to increase his production. He can now run the risk of introducing new lines to his shops, knowing he can adjust his production according to how well an item is doing. Well, the low cost of the micro has enabled small businesses as well as departments of large companies to get easy access to computing. Of course, there are snags, but there are also real benefits. This week, we shall be looking at the business software available for micros and what guidelines to follow in buying it. And we shall be seeing some of the problems of writing your own business programs. The most used business software on micros is for financial planning, the sort of package being used to plan the production and distribution from the Crown Bakery. Its great advantage is the rapidity with which the model can be written and how easily changes can be made. Let's look at this. It's a little profit and loss statement for a landscape gardener. And on the top line here, on income, he's got what his revenue he expects to be each quarter, spring, summer, autumn and winter. He's got the costs of his plants, which is half his income. He's got the wages of one man here, and he's got the rent of his officers. Totaling those 3, plants, wages and rent, he has his costs, and subtracting that from his income, he gets his profit line here. Well, one of the spreadsheet system is you're not limited, the size of the spreadsheet, to the size of the screen you're operating on. You can imagine the screen being a window, being able to move it around and look at any place you like on the spreadsheet. And you do this by moving the screen, and it will bring in the column there on the right-hand side and lose a column on the left-hand side. And this is the total for the year. So he's got a revenue of £53,081 with a total of £12,000 profit at the bottom right-hand corner. So it looks a very healthy business. So in addition to this, what he has done, he's actually produced a bank statement to see what the impact has on his bank. And we can look at that very quickly. And that's his bank account that would be a result of those revenues, if he achieves those revenues and the costs were the same. He has an opening balance of 0. The money comes in on the credits. He's got debits as he pays for his flowers and pays for the individuals, and he's got drawings of £2,500 per quarter, and it leaves quite a nice healthy balance in the bank itself. Well, that looks fine. But then he has the opportunity of doubling his revenue from the summer onwards, and that's where a computerized spreadsheet modeling system really comes into its own. All he has to do is to type in the new numbers and ask a what-if question. What if my summer onwards, what is the impact going to be on my revenues, on my profits, and on my bank balance? And all he has to do is to type in those new numbers. So he goes back to his original model and types in the numbers. And you can see here his income is going to change from the summer onwards, and it's going to double. So we simply type in 26,000, and that will modify it throughout the year. He's reckoning his income will grow slightly each quarter, but with the doubling of his work, he needs another man, so he's going to double his wages. 3250, and that will continue for the rest of the year. And we can very quickly look at the impact that has had, again by scrolling to look at the total column. At the top, he's got a substantially increased income of 93,662, and at the bottom, a profit here before tax of 27,456, which is 15,400 or so pounds over what he was going to make. So it looks like a good business on the face of it. But then he says, well, let's have a look at the impact on my bank statement. And, of course, the numbers have been reflected in the bank statement, and we look at that, and to his surprise, he finds that in the summer, he's overdrawn by £1,418. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward, that he's had to pay out for his plants, and he had to pay his wages before the money has come in from his new customer. Well, you might say, well, so what? But he could take this plan along to the bank and say, look, I have an opportunity to double my business. It is going to mean me going to an overdraft for the summer, but the rest of the year it will be cleared away, and presumably a good bank manager would give him an overdraft facility to cover that shortfall. But there's much more to business software on Micros than financial planning systems. There's accounting packages, word processing, payroll. It's an almost endless list. But with over 200 different Micros on the market and an amazing selection of software, it's easy to get quite bewildered. Our researcher, Catherine Robbins, has been to see a very small business in South London run by two women who feel they have problems a computer might help them solve, and they're not sure just how or where to begin.
Two years ago, Hazel Radcliffe gave up her job as a teacher and set up work in an upstairs room at home. She and her friend, Christine Warthen, had been teachers of machine knitting and had soon realized how many people needed extra tuition in this area. So they got together to write a collection of notes and leaflets, which soon turned into a full-colour magazine, Knitting Machine Digest.
Fine, thank you.
Well, 12 issues on, and with a circulation which has grown to around 8,000, Hazel and Christine are beginning to find themselves really bogged down in the time-consuming paperwork which goes with publishing any successful magazine.
After the first 2 or 3 issues, it was quite easy for us to remember what had been in the magazine. But now if we were to have a phone call and somebody would, let's say, we've seen a sock pattern in your magazine, we'd like that particular issue, which one was it, please? It then involves us searching through the back issues to see exactly which one the socks were in. We do keep them on record separate from the magazine, but they're all in boxes and files and they're all cross-referenced, and it's very difficult to go straight to what you want, especially if somebody's waiting on the telephone. Subscriptions are never straightforward. At the moment, we make out a record card and then we make them out 5 more labels to cover the rest of the year. But then halfway through the year, somebody will change their subscription. They want to move house and give us their change of address, and it means searching through each of the files and changing each one manually. Whereas we feel if it was recorded on a computer, we'll be able to get to the information straight away and change it very quickly.
We send out an invoice, then you wait, then you have to send out a statement, then you have to send out a restatement, and it takes an awful lot of time and chasing and following up. And we feel that with the computer, quicker, B, it would be much safer because we'd know exactly where we were.
But is a computer really the best answer to all these problems? Surely it would be much simpler to employ an...
For a small business, one of its advantages, its main advantage over a large concern, is that it is able to turn around an idea quickly. If we were to employ somebody else, it would be very difficult to find somebody who knew what we were talking about, both in machine knitting terms and in terms of the magazine.
But while deciding to buy a computer is one thing, finding the right sort of machine to suit one's needs is quite a different matter.
First of all, we looked at the magazines, but we didn't find them very helpful because they assumed you knew what they were talking about, and we hadn't got a clue.
We feel we might have made a mistake in talking to sort of friends about computers, because one person who uses one particular type of computer obviously thinks that's great, but if there was somewhere where you could tell them exactly what you needed and then they could assure you that not only suited you now, but would suit you as the business grew, because hopefully this business is going to grow and grow, and if it grows at the rate that it has done over the last 2 years, then we don't want to buy a computer that in a couple of years' time.
Well, that's an example of a very small business in a fairly common situation. They've identified problem areas in their business, in their case subscriptions, accounting, and some sort of information retrieval. Well, with me today is Colin Harris of the NCC Microsystems Centre in London, whose job it is to give advice to businesses about micros and their software. Colin, what advice would you give in this case?
Well, before I give any advice at all, I'd like to clear up 3 specific items. First of all, I'd like to make certain that I understood fully what was being asked. Secondly, I'd like to be clear in my own mind that the problem could and should be handled by a microcomputer. And thirdly, I'd like to make certain that in my mind again, it was economically viable. Now, in this particular instance, I would regard using a proprietary information retrieval system as being a very good answer. This would cope quite adequately with 3 of the major things that they've mentioned. First of all, there's the subscription accounting and the ability to transfer a mailing list onto a machine and produce labels automatically. Secondly, there were the questions that they were being asked about what patterns were in what particular issues. And thirdly, the advice they were asked to give as to whether a training centre or club was available in certain areas. I believe that this particular type of situation lends itself very much to a package of that type.
And using a package, you'd be able to get it up that much more quickly than writing it with an ordinary program.
Certainly, and in fact we did just that in the Microsystems Centre, and if we look at the screen here, we'll see an example of what we did. We tested out the subscription situation, and in the top left-hand corner here, of the name and address of a particular subscriber. If we move down to the bottom on the left, we can see elements there of when they joined, what the subscription amount is, and whether or not it's been paid recently. The top right, we have details here of the machines that are owned by this particular subscriber. And finally, on the bottom right, we have the most important things of all as far as we're concerned, which are the details of what club night is being run, when the time of a particular training session is being achieved. We took perhaps 2.5 hours, that's all, to set up within the particular package that we're talking about the details of this particular requirement.
And how long would it have taken you if you'd have written it in, say, BASIC or some language like that?
Well, that's very difficult to assess, of course, but I would imagine that it would be 2, 3, or perhaps even 4 weeks to successfully accomplish what we managed to do in 2.5 hours.
And then there's all the problems of updating it and changing it when you're finished.
Certainly, and one of the beauties about this particular package, this piece of software, this program, is that it is very easy for the users to be able to change it. Once they become more familiar with its use, they may decide that they want certain elements changed. It's very simple for them to learn to change it themselves.
And what equipment did you recommend?
Well, equipment was fairly straightforward and simple to recommend. We decided that they would need a screen with a keyboard naturally. They'd need the computer with 2 disk drives and obviously a printer for producing their subscription lists and also their name and address labels. We felt that that should easily be contained within a figure of £3,000 to £4,000.
And was it an economic proposition going to your third area? Was it an economic
To my mind, it was an economic proposition, otherwise I wouldn't have carried it forward. But I must leave this decision to the client. This is the decision they have to make, whether in their view, with my advice and with the advantages and disadvantages that I feel the system would provide, they have to decide finally whether it was economically viable for them.
It sounds almost miraculous that you're able to do something in 2.5 hours. And that excludes, of course, setting up all their files of their 8,000 subscribers, but do it in 2.5 hours when programming would take 3 weeks. What are the limitations?
Well, there are 2 major limitations with this system. First of all of the information with regard to one subscriber, shall we say, has to be contained within the size of one screen. Secondly, the number of subscribers, in this case we only have 8,000, but the number of subscribers would be limited under this system to 65,000.
So they've got plenty of room for expansion from 68 to 64.
Yes, indeed they have. But the disadvantage with this, although it isn't a disadvantage in this case. There are no mathematical capabilities associated with this particular package. We can't add, multiply, divide, etc. This is purely an information retrieval package.
Well, thanks a lot, Colin. Well, in this case, a commercial package was used, but there is another way. Patrick Eager is a professional photographer who specialises in providing cricket photographs for clients around the world. Back in the office, he uses a micro to help with the day-to-day jobs of running a photographic business. Jobs like which client has which photograph, and printing the delivery notes, captions, and reminders that go out with each batch of photos. Interestingly enough, the software that does all this, he wrote himself. Get any commercial software?
Well, several reasons. I mean, there was one which was almost suitable, but it was very expensive. The guy wanted a lot of money for it. And I thought, well, that's too much. Personally, I really wasn't prepared to risk that sort of money.
You knew exactly what you wanted as the output for your final programs? Or
Well,
did you really change around a lot?
Both. And the structure was a way of booking out photographs, or there's a system I'd got manually.
Yes.
And I wanted to retain that.
I
because
see. So you converted your manual system as near as possible to this, so it wasn't
Exactly.
strange.
Exactly.
Sensible.
But at the same time, you kept coming up with ideas that things you could do. I mean, for example, here we've now done the delivery note. In the old days, you'd also have a delivery note, but it says at the bottom, do you want to print out? We've done them, so you press that. And do you want an address label? Well, yes. So it'll now do a thing that says, photographs do not bend, and there's your address. Admittedly, it's on ordinary paper, you have to cut it out and stick it on, but I mean, it's not too much hardship.
What difficulties did you get into programming it?
It was a little bit difficult to start with, as I'd not met it before. And inevitably you come across the occasional bug.
What about all your accounting? Surely you could have bought standard packages rather than write your own.
Yes, but they all got sort of ledger and daybook and purchase ledger. I mean, I honestly, I'm not an accountant. I haven't a clue anything about accounting at all. And my accountant tells me, he says, look, keep a list of what comes in, what goes out, and let me know. This all accountancy program which I wrote.
Again, which you wrote yourself?
Yeah, and which doesn't involve any accountancy terms at all. And it just sort of says make an invoice, pay in a cheque. And it's as simple as that. Oh, no, I'll show you, look. There we go. And that's a listing, which is about 25 pages there, I suppose, and...
What, about 1,000 instructions?
Probably, yeah.
Of course, the bigger the program is, the more you end up by having to maintain. Itself wears out, but your needs change.
Yes,
VAT might change from 15% to something else, or you get multiple levels of VAT. How do you cope with that?
But you're quite right. I mean, if you change a line here and you accidentally forget that a certain variable had a certain value, and or you change a line number, the whole thing can just go to pieces. And it does take a long time to patch it up.
After you've got the system installed and it's running and working, you're happy with it, what's been the benefit to you?
Oh, many, but I mean, I think the biggest thing is that it's given me so much more time to do other things. I mean, the things that matter, like actually going out to cricket grounds and photographing cricket.
Well, it's clear what benefits Patrick Eager got out of installing a microcomputer. With us today, we have Ian Trackman, who wrote most of the software for the series. Ian, would you recommend a businessman to go about it the way that Patrick did?
No, certainly not, I wouldn't. Leaving aside the time it takes to get to that proficiency of programming, to be able to write a commercial program, which must be several months, it still must have taken Patrick weeks to write that program.
And then there's all the problems of maintaining it afterwards.
Yes, if you were to cost that up in real cost to his business, he must be better off buying a package. Now, a couple of years ago, maybe package, but today, there's no doubt we could have found a package that would have done the job that he wanted virtually to his absolute requirements. And that, of course, is a very important thing. We must say to his credit, he did have a very clear idea of what he wanted the program to do, which is probably the most important thing about putting a business application onto a computer.
Well, we seem to be recommending that a businessman should go out and try and find a package to suit what he wants to do. But how does a businessman go about selecting a package?
Well, there are a number of sources that he can go to, but I would think that perhaps the most logical sequence would be, first of all, to get the trade magazines and start reading through and seeing what packages are available. Most of them run a reference list of one sort or another. Then from that they would move to the dealers, the people who supply both the hardware and software, and try out one or two of these packages. When they feel reasonably happy with some of them, to ask the dealers to, for a list of those people who are actually using them, not a specific. These are a number of people that are using them. Try them and see what they feel about them. In addition, of course, he could go to an independent consultant who would not only try and select the right package, but also try and clarify the ideas as to what it is he really wants.
And he might obtain information from the manufacturer, or if he was in a specialised area, for example, a travel agent or a dentist or so on, to go to his association who could recommend users like that.
But there is one thing, Mac, if you don't go to a specialist, you should be warned that there's an awful lot of rubbish around, rubbish software.
How do you define rubbish software?
Well, I suppose we ought to be more specific. It's not just, when you buy a package, it's not just the program. Besides the program, there's the documentation, which explains how to run the program, how to make changes, if the circumstances of your business change. And there's also the question of support, going back to the software house or the manufacturer of the software for help when something goes wrong.
And training, I expect. So any one of those areas that's bad, you would define that as fairly rubbish.
Yes, I mean, it's easy enough to have a look at the documentation and see if you can follow it. The program itself is a bit harder to tell whether that's badly written, but there's a couple of small tests you could try. Often a business package will start out by asking you to enter the date. Put in 31st of February. Just see what happens, because if it accepts that, then you've got troubles down the line. And another thing is, when, for instance, the program asks you to put a disk in the disk drive, leave the door of the drive open and see what happens. If it comes up with a message like CDOS error, that's very unfriendly, and I wouldn't recommend a package like that.
So we've gone out, we've found a piece of software we wanted, we've gone to a consultant, he's recommended it, we've gone to somebody else who's actually using it, we've got our software. How do we go about selecting the hardware?
Well, I think the most essential piece of software is to make sure that that piece of software works on the piece of hardware that we like. So that's the first thing. Secondly, that the piece of software, that piece of hardware should be able to grow with the user so that he can add other things. And thirdly, that the piece of hardware should have the largest possible availability of commercial software so that it can use any piece that he wants.
How does he measure the benefits once he's got his hardware and software? How do you measure the benefits as a consultant?
Well, it's very difficult to measure benefits, which is why I always leave that element to, as much as I can, to the client. But there is efficiency, and how does one measure efficiency? There are certain basic applications where it's relatively easy. For example, if you're collecting your money, if you've got your sales ledger on a computer, you can measure quite easily how much quicker the money is coming in because your statements are going out very much faster. There's that sort of application. But as I say, in terms of efficiency, it's very difficult to measure what efficiency is.
Well, thank you, Colin. Thank you, Ian. Well, next week we'll turn to how a computer can be made to make music and to speak to us. We'll also start to look at languages other than BASIC and enter the world of artificial intelligence. Until then, goodbye.
To accompany this series, the BBC has produced a book for use with the cassette-based British Broadcasting Corporation Model B microcomputer. The pack costs £12.95 and is available from bookshops and micro dealers.